Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This week's Torah portion is Behaalotecha. Behaalotecha et hanerot, when you will raise up the candles. Raising up the candles is the concept of raising up our lights around us, give people Jewish pride around us, not just light them up. We have a mitzvah to actually raise up the people around us, especially with everything that's going on in the world right now, to raise up all the Jewish people around us and give them tremendous Jewish pride. I've seen tweets from people saying, if you're afraid to walk around you shouldn't walk around with a yarmulke. This is the opposite. This is the time when you should specifically, if you weren't wearing a yarmulke till now, to walk around with a yarmulke. If you weren't coming to shul, then this is the time to go to shul, to raise up the candles around us. And so this is the first message of this week's Torah portion. But towards the end of this week's Torah portion, we have a strange story, and that is Miriam talks to Aaron, and he talks to her about Moshe's relationship with his wife, and she's talking slander as a big sister to her younger brother, or to his older brother about her younger brother. And because of that, Hashem gets very upset, and he comes to them in a vision, and they're very embarrassed about it. And when they come out of the tent of meeting, it says that Miriam had saras. So she had the what some people call sarai, where the word psoriasis came from, but she had this disease, the saras, from talking slander, from talking lashon hara. It was a physical malady, which would come from a spiritual ailment, and that was talking bad about another person. And so it says that how it works was, if somebody would get saras, they would have to go outside the camp for 7 days, and they have to re-enter the camp to understand how it is to be with people. To be with people, you shouldn't talk bad about people. But it says that in the merit of Miriam's good deed that she did 81 years earlier, the camp did not leave during her quarantine period. And only after she was done her quarantine period did the camp leave. And the Rebbe asked a question on this. What does it mean? What was the big deal that the camp didn't leave while she was during her quarantine period? Ultimately, how could they leave? What would happen to all people that had saras? They would put them outside the camp, and then if they would start traveling, remember the camp was a temporary encampment that moved 42 times, they would just leave the people in the back, leave them behind to die in the desert outside of the cloud. Once they were off the cloud, they were out and they couldn't get back in once the camp would move. And the Rebbe explained no. The Rebbe explained what happened with all people with saras was, if the camp was about to move, they couldn't actually go outside the camp, and so they would have to quarantine much longer. For example, if the camp was if you had saras and the camp started traveling for another month, you had to actually quarantine yourself for that month, because you couldn't be inside the community, and only then go outside for 7 days. And so, in the merit of the mitzvah that Miriam did, the camp stopped, even though they were supposed to start traveling, to wait for her time to go outside the 7 days, and only after that would start traveling. Like this, she shouldn't inconvenience her by having a longer quarantine than necessary, which is something that we can now actually understand what that means, about having to quarantine for things which weren't necessary. When we saw someone with COVID, we went with someone to a place with COVID, and now we're stuck, and we get stuck at home, and we can't do anything. And so we always want to make sure that we have the maximum time that we don't have to quarantine, or the minimum time that we have to quarantine. What was this mitzvah that Miriam did? And so the mitzvah that Miriam did was, remember, 81 years prior, when Paro made the edict that a Jewish boy has to be killed in the sea, Yocheved, the mother of Moshe Rabbeinu, put him into a basket. And Batya, the daughter of Paro, comes down to the Nile River and sees there's a baby in a basket. And so she stretches out her arms, bring in this baby. But this baby, Moshe, was crying because he needed some milk from his mother. And so right away, Miriam was waiting there by the reeds to see what would come and say, and right away came and offered and says, I have a Jewish mother who's willing to give the baby Moses milk. And so ultimately, she brought Moshe Rabbeinu back to his mother. And so he's able to have the benefit. She was able to do this mitzvah, that she wasn't able to inconvenience a baby child who wouldn't be comfortable getting milk from another place, or food from another place, or from a non-Jewish mother, and then she got it from his own mother. Because of that, he didn't inconvenience her. Ultimately, later on, 81 years later, he makes sure that God doesn't inconvenience her, Miriam, by traveling, by the camp moving, and like this, she'd only have the 7 days outside the encampment and not a longer quarantine. and teach us the power of doing someone a favor. Sometimes we'll do someone a favor. This wasn't the most incredible thing that she did for Moshe Rabbeinu. Ultimately, Moshe's life was saved by Ba'ya's daughter. Ultimately, Moshe Rabbeinu would have got food or milk from another mother or from another place. Many people they could have fed them a bottle, whatever the source of milk was at the time. But because she made sure that her brother would not be inconvenienced, 81 years later, Moshe Rabbeinu makes sure, or God makes sure, that his sister will be merited because of that thing that she saved, Moshe Rabbeinu not being inconvenienced. And so when we do a mitzvah for somebody, when we do a favor for someone, even though it might seem like a small favor or a small deed, we don't know how that impact could be in that person's life. And we also don't know that when we can get rewarded for such an impact. As we see with Miriam, it took 81 years later. And so too, we should always make sure that we should never slander someone, but even further, when we do something positive, God's willing, God will repay us, even if it's at the end of our life. Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and see you in Shul.